fun title and a great place to be. And he's really gonna talk to us about a system that he's worked on and developed and the science that went into it. And I think you're gonna be really interested in this. And I think what's really important is that this presentation really marries the relationship between science and what we can do in industry. So I think it really is a great example of that, and it's work that's really pushing things forward and makes those of us in the smart and connected health world very proud. So with that, Dr. Ayer.
Thank you, Wendy. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning if you're in other geographies. What Wendy might not have told you, which I think is important in this conversation, is I am a wireless guy. I've been in the wireless industry for nearly 20 years, and oddly enough, in the early 2000s, 2002, I developed type 2 diabetes myself. So I affectionately joke that the two things that define me as a person, one is good, which is wireless in my blood, and one is not so good, which is too much sugar in my blood, but somehow WellDoc has brought the two together. Imagine, if you would, for a second, just to set the stage of where we're headed in this conversation, imagine, if you would, a type 2 diabetes patient who walks in to see their doctor. Just like they would do, say, 3 to 4 times a year to get their labs drawn and talk about their diabetes. And imagine this doctor now prescribing a new drug to their patient alongside their other existing therapies, be they insulins or orals or other injectables. And this new drug has shown outcomes in cluster randomized control studies that are 2 to 3 to 4 times better than the average diabetes drug out there. And that this drug has been approved, like all other drugs, by the FDA. And it's dispensed as you would normally expect a drug to be dispensed from the pharmacy, and it's reimbursed by the health plan. But imagine if that drug that met all of those criteria were a mobile solution, a mobile app. And that's kind of where we're headed, that says, how do you, as Wendy said, how do you collectively take science, in this case, really two forms of science, clinical science and behavioral science, and how do you marry them with technology and innovative business models to affect unheard of outcomes in diabetes, and certainly extensible to other chronic conditions? And so with that, I wanted to jump in and kind of trace this journey and really focus on some of the key learnings and success factors along the way, because we do think that in many ways this represents a part, if not a large part, of the future of how we treat chronic conditions, not just diabetes, but certainly across the spectrum of other diseases as well. So if you start to think about what forms our opportunity, no surprises, not just here in the United States, but around the globe, we have a chronic disease pandemic. The overwhelming percentage of GDPs in the G7 and emergent economies pay, if you would, for chronic diseases represents a good 40, 50, 60% of total healthcare spend. And there's an exponential growth in incidence versus, if you would, the flat or linear growth in the capacity to manage. It's interesting when you actually plot the number of patients with diabetes and you plot the capacity of the healthcare system to treat that, and there's a growing gap between the two. And diabetes is an interesting disease, not unlike other chronic conditions, that actually requires the frequent teachable moments and self-management. You can't treat this disease while you're in the doctor's office, say, for 5 minutes 4 times a year every 3 months. You actually require a great deal of self-management, and so therein lies a major problem, or perhaps an opportunity. At the same time, we're in the midst of unprecedented healthcare reform. When you think about it, we are shifting from volume-based to value-based care, where there's a propensity, if you would, to pay for outcomes and not necessarily pay to just ship a therapy or ship a device. And clearly with that comes a focus on quality and accountability, because now you can actually measure it. And with this reform, there's also this increased recognition and, dare I say, pressure that's being caused by, the social aspect, consumerism. In many ways, the future of health, whilst it didn't involve a great deal of consumerism in the past, is now going to involve a great deal of consumer perspective. What patient doesn't go into their doctor today and say, hey, I read on the internet, or I saw this article and I think I should be on this therapy and that therapy, but it starts the dialogue in a different way that was heretofore unknown for decades. At the same time, when you look at the life sciences industry, and this is the pharmaceutical, biomedical device companies, there's a massive opportunity for compliance and adherence. If I think about the pharma industry in specific, and you look at any drug, any disease state, and you look at what happens out at the 12th refill, perhaps at the 16th refill, they call them persistence and compliance numbers. The numbers are abysmal. They're down in the 18 to 23% range. And so when you think about it, pharma companies have spent billions and billions of dollars to bring these very important compounds to market, but they're being consumed at a rate that's not commensurate with what is prescribed by a doctor. In the case of insulin, there's a number called treat-to-target ratio. And when you look at treat-to-target ratios as what's measured today versus what patients are actually consuming, there's almost a good doubling or tripling possibility because people aren't taking their drugs the way they should. And then there's a whole series of dominoes that follow in terms of hospitalizations or degeneration in their other health parameters. There's also the patent cliffs when you start to think about just how quickly new generics are coming on the market. Drug companies can't sit behind, if you would, those protected patents anymore. And so there's an investment conundrum at the end of the day. Do I spend my additional $1 in investment to do something that might increase the consumption of what I've already developed and increase the ROI on that, to return on investment? Or should I actually go and spend an average of whatever the latest number is, $6, $7, $8 billion to invest in a new drug? And so there's an opportunity from the life sciences perspective. And lastly, we are sitting in an unprecedented time with mobile technology. There are now more cell phones on the planet than there are toothbrushes. It is without question the fastest growing technology really in the history of the world. And it has some interesting characteristics. I mean, here is a technology that the richest of the rich have and the poorest of the poor have globally. It knows no socioeconomic barriers. As a diabetes patient, I may leave home without my blood glucose meter, but I promise you I'll never leave home without my cell phone. And so this is actually an interesting opportunity that says, can we leverage this ubiquitous platform that knows none of these socioeconomic barriers to actually take advantage of the healthcare reform, the issues we have with this pandemic, and of course the opportunities for the life sciences industry at large. So just to give you a sense of what we're up against in diabetes, here are the numbers for the United States as most recently published by the American Diabetes Association. 1 out of every 11 people in the States, but what's perhaps more alarming is 1 out of every 4 don't even know they have diabetes. And when you look at pre-diabetes, which is often referred to as this metabolic syndrome, more than 1 out of 3 adults have it, and in fact the CDC reports that 1 out of every 3 people in the United States born after the year 2000 will likely develop diabetes. The numbers are staggering here. It's about 8 to 9% of our population, but if you leave the United States, the numbers get worse. If you go to China, the numbers hover in the 12 to 15%, India 15 to 18%. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is 8 countries, has the highest incidence, often exceeding 30% of their population. And so this is a big, big global problem. But perhaps a bigger problem outside of the incidence is the cost we incur. Here in the United States, the latest figures are about $245 billion. And that's a whopping 10% of our total healthcare spend, the $2.3 trillion we spend in this country on healthcare. It's a big number. And when you start to look at the risks of adults who have diabetes, it's 50% higher than people who don't have diabetes. And the risks are typically the 5, if you would, highest ranking comorbidities of the disease: the blindness, kidney failure, heart conditions, stroke, and amputations. And so again, we have an immense opportunity to not just treat the numerator, just the incidence and the health outcomes, but we have an immense opportunity to decrease the denominator, because these kinds of costs aren't sustainable for our country. They're not sustainable for any country at that matter. So that's at the macro level, but when you actually go down to the micro level and say, okay, there's a big problem at this top, fine, great. What's actually happening between the patient and the physician? There have been more than 10,000 articles in various medical journals that have been written in the last 15 years that talk about this concept of patient-physician discordance. Doctor says X, patient hears Y. It's like the Charlie Brown wah, wah, wah. There's a discussion that seems to happen when the patient walks into their doctor's office, but the patient has an agenda. The patient has a series of troubles or barriers or fears on their mind. And the doctor is there, especially now with accountable care. Hey, I need to get your A1Cs to level. I got to get your lipids, your blood pressure. I got to get eye exams, foot exams, all these things that are in the quality metrics. And this is actually what's happening with the patient. They may have walked in, they may have lost their job, they may have troubles at home, and it's literally square peg in a round hole. And this is the context of a typical healthcare visit. And so Once again, there's an opportunity at the macro level, but we see here there's an opportunity if there's a way to actually align these two discussions such that the objectives, the tactics, the actions, and the outcomes are aligned between the physician and the patient, then we actually have a chance to move the needle. So it literally feels like this. Some days I feel like this. I remember when I was diagnosed back in 2002 and my glucose levels would vary because I just didn't know what I was doing, is the honest truth. Today I'm a WellDoc and BlueStar consumer, which has obviously helped, but this is what it feels like. And this is what it feels like regardless of who you are in the ecosystem. You could be the patient, you could be the provider. I mean, every provider we talk to says, you know, my patients, they know what to do, but they're just lazy, they don't want to do it. I mean, I tell them to manage their weight and their diet, and patients say exactly the opposite. They say, look, I don't know what to do. I wish I had time to sit down with my doctor, but I got 3 minutes. I'm willing to try it if he or she tells me, but I don't know what to do. And so again, this discordance is hurting us, but that's kind of what it feels like. So there's a lot of stuff going on, right? There's new drugs that are being introduced. How many new therapies have been introduced for type 2 diabetes in the last 2 decades? And there's, you know, new innovations by the meter companies and faster meters that count down, you know, 5 seconds instead of that, 4 seconds. Or, you know, I now have a 0.6 microliter requirement versus a 0.7 microliter blood requirement from a little pin, a 33 gauge pin. And as a patient, I say, look, I already have a hole in my finger. It doesn't matter. I'll just hold it down for longer. And that's not what patients are looking for to innovate. So there's a lot of stuff happening, but in the midst of this, the numbers are getting worse, the costs are getting worse, the outcomes are getting worse. You know the story. And so I ask, are we focusing on perhaps the wrong problem? I love this picture because the guy caught the vase, but he broke his hand. Are we perhaps focusing on the wrong problem or problems? Are we focusing on what we can see versus perhaps the latent issues that need to be addressed? You start to think about latent issues, for example, depression and the incidence of undiagnosed depression in people who have chronic conditions. And it sits in the 20 to 30 to 40% range, depending upon the chronic condition you're talking about. But who goes to the doctor and says, hey, doc, I'm depressed? And so perhaps there's an opportunity to focus on a different set of problems that will then allow us to better the outcomes. I would actually assert that if I were to summarize all of what I've said in diabetes, both from a problem standpoint and from a solution standpoint, there's really 2 things we have to work on, and I'd say only 2 at this point. One is we have to figure out how to get the right data to the right person at the right place and the right time. And that's an easy problem to solve. That's technology. That's been done by other industries. It's been done in utilities and supply chain and financial services. And there's this continuum, if you would, that allows connectivity to occur in a seamless kind of sense. The bigger problem is how do you then take that data, as I go forward and not backward in our presentation, my apologies. How do I take that data and convert it into information, knowledge, and actions on behalf of both the patient as well as the provider to then derive the outcomes, both numerator health outcomes and denominator cost outcomes, in a smart way? And I put smart here literally. That means it has to be specific, it has to be measurable, it has to be actionable, and it has to be real time. And if you can convert and extract value from this data continuum, as I put on my data science hat, if you're able to extract the value from that data and inform patients on patterns, behaviors, things that they're doing well, things that they could do better, never punish them. If they put in a glucose value that's high, you should never tell them, my God, it's high, what did you do? You should say, I'm glad you tested. Now let's work on that high value. So if you can actually convert that information into knowledge in a manner that suits the patient's fear structure, health literacy level, the education level, perhaps just their socioeconomic levels, etc., then you can drive the actions and get the outcomes you need. And so interstage left mobility, as we've talked about, is there hope? I say the audacity of hope, the President's book. Here again is a technology that has ubiquitous access. It's interesting to see in our studies that have led us to the point we are today, where even in the Medicaid population, people may not have had an extra loaf of bread to eat, but they have a smartphone, and they use their smartphone. It's their lifeline. And so in many ways, what mobility has allowed us to do, you'll hear the words in the wireless industry called seamless mobility. And what seamless mobility is all about is the change in customer paradigm. In the past, we used to go to our services, right? We would go to the bank, and now, courtesy of Apple, now we may have payment models that are built on phones. In the past, you would go to the travel agent, or you'd go to the website, or you'd go to the doctor to get your blood glucose and lab results. But now, the model, of course, in the past was you would go to X. Now the model is X comes to you. So it's a reversal, it's a paradigm shift. And that's an important transformative opportunity that mobility enables, is this seamless mobility where now things come to you. The patient is in the center. We talk about patient-centered medical home. The patient is in the center of the equation, and all of the things that require interaction with the patient are a constellation around the patient. But they dictate, they govern, they drive, but they do it in a way that's meaningful against evidence-based medicine, that's meaningful against what their physician wants them to do. And so we were faced with this opportunity nearly 9 years ago, back in 2005, and it was interesting to see what people did with technology. For example, there were companies that were saying, hey, look, put your blood glucose value into a phone, and I'll use the cell phone to beam the data over to a nurse, and the nurse will pick up the phone and call the patient and say, here's what you should do. And that's a great model. It's wonderful if you have enough nurses, but it's not a cost-effective, scalable model. At that point, we said, listen, we really need to create something, and we're going to roll the dice. What we'd like to do is create something that has clinical value, that's steeped and rooted in scientific evidence, because at the end of the day, no health plan would pay for something that hasn't been through the rigor of science and research. But we wanted to do it perhaps in a manner that fit into clinical workflow and patient lives. And that's a huge thing, as I'll come to the business model in a second. You can't ask an overworked, underpaid doctor to do anything. As innovative as it may be, they won't do it if it doesn't fit into their clinical workflow. And so we have to draw those pins in the sandbox. And so this was our life back in 2005. And keep in mind, 2005, there was no iPhone, smartphones, the concept didn't exist. It was the good old Nokia 6600 and the Razor. You all remember those phones. We had limited technology. Today, obviously, the technology has grown immensely, exponentially in its capabilities, processing power, user interfaces, etc., all of which are helpful to treat patients with diabetes. You can imagine the questions we had when we dragged that road in the prior slide. We started out saying, how would people believe this? Therefore, what evidence do I need? And how would I structure a trial? And this is like a drug trial, a clinical trial, but now my drug is a piece of software. But to do that, who would I need to collaborate with? Not just on the private side, on the public side. What regulatory path would be needed? In 2005-06, when we started this journey, there was no FDA guidance document on mobile health. Today, courtesy of Bakul Patel at the FDA, who he and his team and the commissioner have done a wonderful job, because I think they've put their arms around this, even though it's moving faster than anybody could have imagined. But Bakul has a wonderful guidance document that provides, if you would, the basis for companies and other organizations to say, if I'm doing X, Y, or Z with an intended use, then where do I need to fall in the regulatory spectrum? We asked questions about technology, certainly after our first clinical trial when the iPhone was introduced in 2007. What should we adapt? Because now the technology allows a whole lot more to be accomplished. How do you manage all the security? And I'm talking about physical security of the data and all the proper dual authentication, encryption, all that stuff, but also the privacy laws, HIPAA. How would it be distributed? Is it an app? Could it be a higher value thing like a drug or maybe a medical device, and therefore what's the business model? And so these are the type of questions that we faced along the journey. And it was evident to us that really what we needed to do was we needed to work with a number of people in a public, private, academic, collaborative fashion. But we needed to do it in an orderly fashion. It wasn't haphazard, random collaboration. It was a very structured collaboration, which you had all these different swim lanes and different patterns and people and different interests. But I would assert that this model, once you hear the full story, this model has no losers. That everybody wins in this model. I've yet to find in all of my consulting and other work that I've done a disruptive business model where there isn't a loser. On this one, everybody actually wins. And so the first thing we said is we needed to find the right types of partners. And for us, really the first step was building a system. And so what BlueStar is today, the product that WellDoc has created for this type 2 diabetes, is really, in a very simplistic sense, it's 4 major modules. And there's the patient coach. That's a piece of software on their mobile internet device. Could be a cell phone, could be a tablet, could be a PC, could be an iPad, whatever it is. We really don't care. Let people use the devices that they have at their disposal. And this patient coach provides the personalized real-time coaching. It provides all of the support for medications, for their exercise, for their diet, for their sleeping, for all the questions they have about diabetes. We call it the 360. And so if we can put information in as a patient and get information back, and that information back is tailored, it's personalized to me, it's personalized to my med regimen, it's personalized to my medical history, and most importantly, it's personalized to what my doctor wants me to do. And so in effect, that personal coach is literally personalized, customized, configurable software that's right for me. It's a software that fits a market of n equals 1. At the same time, there's a clinical decision support side that says, can I take the data? Can I take all of the patterns and observations? And I don't want to bombard doctors. Can you imagine a doctor with 100 patients on BlueStar and they're getting, whether it's emails or text messages about their glucose? That's the last thing that they want. This company was founded by an endocrinologist who was practicing at the Joslin Center for Diabetes at the University of Maryland, and she said, hey, that's not what we're trying to do. But if you can take all of that data, the picture, the 360, and you can provide it to a doctor, say, in a one-page report, right, that has, in simplicity, here's where they were, here's where they are, here's what's changed, here's what medicine and evidence-based medicine suggests you might want to do, then this is a tool for you, but you're the doctor, do what you think is right for the patient. And if you can provide that clinical decision support, can you move the needle on outcomes, which I'll talk about momentarily. So you have the patient coach in one hand, you have this clinical decision support that's accessible, whether it's via fax or it's through the electronic platforms that many folks are adopting today. And they're linked by this cloud-based expert system that looks for all the longitudinal patterns, it looks for the events, it looks for the out-of-bounds things, and it either informs the personal patient coach or it informs the clinical decision support. And then lastly, when you think about chronic diseases, one of the issues that you hear about often in the literature is it's lonely to have a chronic disease. And if technology can help take that loneliness away, by either having the technology itself act as a trusted advisor, but if you can also bring in the social component. And you start to think about how the social component manifests in different ethnic groups, the Italians, the Hispanics, African Americans, these are very societally connected people. And so if you're able to bring society together and take whether it's cultural beliefs, whether it's practices, and you can embed them into this and create a community where a person can go, where they feel they can go without being judged. It's a judgment-free zone, as our founder says. Then you can actually affect the needle. And so the system we built was really these 4 things, and it was really rooted, if you would, on 3 analytical, clinical, and behavioral science, as I'll discuss momentarily. If you take a horizontal view of the product, and this is actually interesting because this extends not just to diabetes, it extends beyond diabetes. Any chronic condition requires the judicious management of medications against a physician's medication regimen, symptoms against symptomology, lifestyle for all the diet, exercise, sleep, social, and of course the physiologic, the things that are measured. In the case of diabetes, it's glucose, it's blood pressure, it's lipids, it's weight, BMI, things like that. In asthma, it could be spirometry. In ovarian cancer, it's CA125. And so the concept of these buckets remain the same. So in effect, what we have is a platform. And that platform, the rules may change as you go from disease to disease. The guidelines may change, the drugs may change, but the platform remains intact, which allows the scalability and extensibility that we talked about. So with that, an important part of the solution right at ground zero was we couldn't scotch tape security onto the system. And this is actually very significant. It's significant because it's not as simple as just saying, listen, I'm just going to add a VPN on top of your data transmission pipe. It talks about how do you properly encrypt data that's captured on these devices to the tune of what NIST has certified, 256 AES encryption. Can I encrypt on the link, whether that link is a wire link or it's a wireless link? Can I encrypt on the server? And can I observe and manage all the rules that are required for privacy, de-identification of data, and all that good stuff? And this is not something that's typical of the plethora of applications that are out there in the Google Android market, in the iTunes store, where people haven't taken a deliberate, I'm going to build the application for securability, the same way I used to build software for testability, design for manufacturability, design for quality. Now we're designing for securability. And this has to pass the muster of the most intense scrutiny on, because you're talking about protected health information and privacy. As Wendy said, once we built the system, the first stop in the journey, if you would, in this train journey, was could we derive outcomes? And if we couldn't derive outcomes, truthfully, we all looked at each other and said we should, go back and, do what we were doing in our prior jobs. And so, is the absence of evidence the evidence of absence? For us, we had to show evidence. Period, full stop. And if we couldn't show that, again, it wasn't worth pursuing. But what we found was fascinating in that evidence. In our very first study that was actually published in Diabetes Technology and Therapeutics, it was a small population, 30 patients, and a small time duration, 3 months. What we saw was A1C, which is the primary marker of diabetes wellness, A1C reduced by over 2 points. Now, I want to explain the significance of what that number is. For those of you who may not know A1C, in very simplistic terms, A1C is an average measure that looks at the volumetric percentage of sugar in your blood. And that means a certain amount of your blood can be sugar. The ADA guideline is it should be 7% or less for a well-controlled diabetes patient. A patient who doesn't have diabetes typically has an A1C around 5.5%. Now, the importance of keeping that number below 7 is as follows. Every 1 point delta, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, represents a 40+% increase in the risk of heart attacks, kidney failure, blindness, amputation, stroke, those 5 things that you saw earlier. And the FDA heralds a drug that drops this number by 0.5 point. And so I'll use Januvia, Merck's wonderful oral diabetes drug, as an example. It drops A1C by 0.8 point. It's a multi-billion-dollar drug. When we achieved a 2-point reduction, people literally looked at us and said, what are they doing, swallowing their phone? We said, no, they're doing what their doctors told them to do. And more importantly, doctors who prescribed this and who got that smart visit report, that clinical decision support, were 5 times more likely to make a medication change or titrate a medication. Now, the significance of that is as follows. Today in the United States in primary care, the average primary care doctor may wait 18 to 24 months before they actually add a second oral agent or another drug to the patient's therapy or titrate. In the case of insulin initiation, the delay is as much as 4 to 6 years. And in that 4 to 6 years, neuropathy, retinopathy, heart conditions are setting in. And so what we saw in this was not just the patient dramatic improvement in their glucose outcomes, but we also saw physician prescribing behavior change. We knew that, so it was really this study that was the impetus for the company to be founded, because we said we're onto something, but we know that this isn't going to pass the muster of scientific scrutiny. We said we must do further studies with larger N's, larger periods of time. And you see on the right a second randomized cluster study that was published in Diabetes Care, which is the Journal of the American Diabetes Association, where we effectively replicated the same thing. And what was interesting in this study is that we actually had a large enough N where we could do different intervention arms. And so we had a control group, placebo, baseline. So this is usual care, meters and strips, see your doctor when you see your doctor. But then we had 3 intervention arms. And in the first intervention arm, the patient got BlueStar and earlier version of BlueStar. The doctor got nothing. In the second intervention arm, the patient got the software. The doctor got access to the raw data in the portal, so if they chose to go in, they could look at it and make sense of the data. But they didn't get that clinical decision support and automated analysis. And of course, in the third group, patient got everything, doctor got everything, and no surprises, we saw the largest A1C drop of 2 points in the last group. What we did see, interestingly enough, is we saw when the patient got the solution, we saw almost 1 point A1C reduction. And so there's value that you can attribute to the patient coaching, but there's additional value, no surprises. People used to ask us in the early days, are you trying to disaggregate the doctor and the patient? We said, no, quite the opposite. We're trying to bring them together. We're trying to bring them together with a common fabric of data that illuminates, if you would, the best possible treatments and pathways for that patient to continue the therapy. So this was fascinating. What's interesting is once we achieved this evidence, the next step for us was, well, we're providing coaching to a patient. We're providing a clinical decision support point of view back to the doctor. What do we do about regulation? And again, this was before the guideline document was available. And truthfully, we didn't know much about the FDA, and I think quite truthfully, they didn't know much about us or mobile health. And this was the prevailing thought in the industry at the time, which was, you know, oh my God, big bad FDA. When in fact, when you sit down and engage in a dialogue and you understand, hey, look, we're interested in patient safety, first and foremost. And we're interested in seeing the test results that demonstrate that you have managed in a very reasonable sense both the risk to a patient and the severity should a risk occur. And we also would like to see secondarily that you've built the product with good manufacturing process, that you've built this thoughtfully that allows traceability, if you would, back from your testing and your test outcomes all the way back to a requirement and an intended objective for the product. And so it's actually interesting, the journey with the FDA has been fascinating. I think that the community, and there are now several organizations, public-private, the mHealth Regulatory Coalition is one great example. If you haven't known or you don't know about them, check out the MRC. Bradley Merrill Thompson, who leads this public-private collaborative effort, where the industry is working very closely with the FDA to further refine the guidelines as more and more of these technologies and these proven capabilities are put through the rigors of clinical trials and are put through the FDA for clearances. The next stop for us was understanding, well, how do we actually deliver this? Is this something that requires just a simple app download? Could it be something that requires perhaps even more? Could it be something that requires a code, a reimbursement code? And so we started working very closely with a number of public-private constituents on the payer side to understand, you know, could this be reimbursed, for example, as a device, or could it be reimbursed as a drug? In long story short, we actually went and we now have a drug code, an NDC code for the product, which is interesting because again, it's software. But this was a very, again, a very important part of our journey, engaging the right public organizations and creating awareness of the value proposition. Today there's, you know, very few things that are at the top of any head of state or country leadership's mind. And they include things like the economy, of course, they include things like global terrorism, Ebola, things like that, but they also include healthcare and the cost of healthcare. And so if we can continue to demonstrate this value proposition of both outcomes in the numerator and cost in the denominator, this dialogue was extremely helpful. So what we were now faced with, you got a check mark on outcomes, you have a check mark on the clearance, you have a check mark on how to put this into the market. It then became the challenge to then say, how do you operationalize it? And operationalizing a disruptive innovation is only as good as you disrupt the outcomes, but not the process. And so if you have a chance to piggyback existing processes, today doctors write prescriptions, pharmacies fulfill prescriptions, they refill prescriptions. If you could take the building blocks of today, but perhaps combine them in innovative ways or you know, possibly uncommon ways, could you actually build a successful business model? And in fact, that's kind of where we're ended at. As you see here, the concept of BlueStar is what we call mobile prescription therapy. In fact, some of you might have seen a press release that just went out yesterday that the American Diabetes Association has recognized what they call mobile prescription therapy, MPT, as a new form of therapy for type 2 diabetes alongside insulins and orals, which is fascinating because it's creating outcomes that are commensurate with, if not better than those things alone. It's cleared, of course, by the FDA. It's prescribed by a doctor. It's fulfilled by a pharmacy, and it's refilled by a pharmacy. And so it's fascinating that last picture of building the building blocks, that it always turns heads when we say, you just think of a new drug and just think of our distribution model as being just like any other pharma company, but it's an app. And it's all the intelligence and devices and services that sit behind that app, which is quite fascinating. So when I look at this now, and you think about that earlier slide about data, information, knowledge, action, my good friend Dr. Malpani in Mumbai recently sent me his book, and it talks about using information therapy to put patients first. And I think we're onto something collectively in the industry. I think that regardless of the chronic condition, if we can use technology, in this case mobile internet devices, and we can use the plethora of sources of new data, you can think of a weight scale or a blood pressure cuff or a smart meter or a Fitbit or things like that that are beaming data into the product has the ability through software to convert that data into information, knowledge, and action. And that's what's going to not just move the needle, that's what's going to sustain movement in the needle and keep the patient healthy over time. And so that's actually quite an opportunity for us. I really do think that this is the future. I mean, at the end of the day, patients are going to get, do you want an app? And in many ways, when I characterize the future, I think there's a couple of things I'd point out. There's one dimension of how do you get data into such products. So I could have multiple sources of data, as I just said. I could have the EMR, I could have a Fitbit, I could have a weight scale, a blood pressure cuff. And so there's this concept of what we call brought in, beamed in, and built in. So there's three ways. And brought in says, in the case of diabetes, I have a J&J or Roche or Abbott meter, and I have my BlueStar software on my phone, and I poke my finger and it says 108, and I type the 108 here. So I'm bringing in the data. I am the manual interoperability between those two devices. The second one, which is beamed in, says I could, if this is a wireless device, and this is a wireless device, and Zigbee, ANT, Bluetooth, whatever your favorite wireless protocol is, connect the two, or it may even be a wired dongle. Built-in says, can I build a new genre of blood glucose meter that is a phone-like device that has a place to put in a strip, but it has a cell chipset and a wonderful processor and a nice touch screen with a wonderful UI, and can I make that a single device? And in fact, these are the types of opportunities we have. So there's one vector of expansion, which is how you get data in and how you interact data from other products. There's a second vector of expansion that says I can clearly apply this to the continuum of chronic disease, and in multiple ways. So first of all, if I think of, I call it the triangle of death, where diabetes is in the middle, where this point is hypertension, this point is hyperlipidemia, and this point is obesity. And if I can solve this problem by taking a big dent out of cost to the healthcare system, at the same time I can think about applying it to the continuum of care. So do I apply it to somebody who's diagnosed? Do I apply it to somebody who's pre-diabetic? Do I offer it to people who may have a family history, who can actually avoid becoming a burden to society from a cost perspective, and who can then live longer, they'll see longer, their kidneys will function longer, etc. So can I give it to them in a preventive model? And then, of course, lastly, no surprises, is geography. As I said earlier, I think that these types of things can expand readily. When you think about the next generation, the millennials, these folks have grown up using technology. For them to be able to manage their health without the use of technology is going to be a foreign concept. And so there's almost a societal pressure, if you would, that's pushing through the pipe this opportunity of technologies like this and programs like this, provided that they are scientifically based, that they've got the evidence, that they've been through safety and regulation, and that there's a plausible business model for the solution. I'll end off with this slide, and then we'll have some time for questions. I say this with great passion, and I say it personally. It goes back to my comment that at the end of the day, it's sometimes lonely to have a chronic condition, and we ought not forget what we can do and just how much impact we can have for people to take away that loneliness. And this, if anything, should inspire the broader community to kind of take this same very deliberate, scientifically oriented, innovative approach, because I think that there's no way one company can solve this on its own. It's a $2.3, $2.4 trillion problem, and it's going to require a lot of innovative solutions, but we should never, ever lose fact of why we're doing this, and we're doing this to affect change and to give hope to a number of patients around the globe who suffer from chronic conditions. And so with that, I'll stop. I thank you for allowing me to share this story and share my perspectives, and we'll open it up for questions, Wendy.
Great. Thank you so much. So I guess I'm going to take the liberty of the first question and say you are now the Chief Data Officer at WellDoc. So talk about the role of data. How do you, WellDoc, conceptualize data as, because I think your mix with academia has been really interesting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. So I'll start out in the, when I first moved to this country, I came down to Carnegie Mellon University for my master's and doctoral degrees in electrical engineering. And my focus was on pattern recognition. So I'll put out there that I am a data junkie of sorts, right from my DNA. But when you think about data, there's two frameworks we should invoke as to what mobile health does. So the first framework is, think of a classic 2x2, okay? And think of the bottom dimension as being the source of my data, okay? And the source is either one of two things. It's either coming from a system, like a lab system or an EMR, or it's coming from the patient, okay? And think of the vertical dimension as being the frequency by which I capture that data, okay? And it's either low frequency or high frequency. And think of where we are today in health. We're in the bottom quadrant. We're in the quadrant that today the data I have is it's either lab data or it's claims data that may come once a quarter or once a year. And what mobile health and products like this do is they expand three vectors. I have low-frequency data that's coming from the patient, their demographics, their med regimen, which doesn't change, but maybe over time a patient's insulin regimen may change, their fears, their beliefs, their knowledge. So I'm getting new input, contextually relevant input about that. And then, of course, there's the high-frequency data. There's the patient entering their stuff, which we're seeing amazingly on average 5 to 6 times a day, which is pretty amazing when you think about that's the nut you want to solve is get them engaged with their health. But then the system itself is publishing high-frequency data. Out of bounds alerts. This is the third time that Anand had a blood glucose that was below 70 mg per deciliter this week. I wonder why. Query, query, query. So that's one view, which says that's the data I collect, right? And that's huge. So for us, it's exponential what you can actually collect. But the second yin-yang of that is, what do you do with the data? Okay. So that also is a 2x2, which is the easiest way to explain it, which is, this axis says I have the data or I don't, and this axis says I know what I'm looking to figure out or I don't. So play it out. This quadrant that says I have data, I know what I'm looking for, that's what we call informative data. It's basic reporting. Show me the percentage of times the patient did X, or show me the percentage of patients who are on multiple oral agents who did Y. And it's just slicing and dicing, it's basic reporting. As I now go north in that equation, I have data, but I don't know what I'm looking for. Can the data teach me something? That's what we call discovery. And that's the classic realm of pattern recognition. You know, clustering algorithms, synthetic discriminant function algorithms, where I can now look at this data and I can say, what? Oh, I noticed something interesting about this population. Let me dig deeper. If I've now found patterns there, I then come down to this quadrant, which we call extrapolate. And extrapolate says, can I build a model? I'll give you a real example. We observed informing blood glucose values, and we specifically started to discover low blood glucose trends. And we said, I wonder if we can actually model in a predictive sense when a patient's going to go hypoglycemic. By the way, for those who are interested in economics, of the $245 billion we spend on diabetes, some 60 or 70 billion is unnecessary hospitalizations due to hypoglycemia. If I can predict it and say, but prediction is difficult because it's sparse data. We've actually just submitted a patent on a predictive model that's 90+% accurate, where I can tell after 10 days of sparse data usage on the 11th stage of the nearest hour that they'll go hypoglycemic. So it's a classification engine. I'm not going to tell them what the number is. I need more data for that. But I can tell them it's going to happen with 90% confidence. And then the last one is adapt, where I now take this and I build new features. So we call it as IDEA, this idea, which is this concept of what we can do with the data. And I think in many ways, if I fast forward to several thousands or tens of hundreds of thousands of patients, the value of the data will outgrow the value of the application itself, because we will learn so much about medicines, and we'll learn about behaviors, and we'll learn about engagement, and I think that will be transformative in and of itself.
Oh, there they are. Sorry, I couldn't see the questions. Has BlueStar considered expanding to other countries that have high prevalence of those lifestyle diseases, such as diabetes and HTN?
That's okay. I get
you get it, but there's other chronic diseases.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually. I was at a fascinating event a year and a half ago where I was invited by PricewaterhouseCoopers to come and present in Cape Town, South Africa, to a health summit of 40 active health ministers from around the world. And there were 4 case studies that were presented, and WellDoc was number 1. And it was fascinating because, as I said earlier, the opportunities in China, in India, in the GCC, in Canada, in the UK are all very high, and we're in discussions with many of these countries to start to put into place. When we think about exporting, if you would, BlueStar, we have to think about many things. We have to think about how you clinically adapt it for the way medicine is practiced in those countries. And then you start to think about the inclusion of things like traditional Chinese medicine in China, Ayurveda in India. And so you want to make this a holistic solution that fits the cultural need of that country. At the same time, you have to think about data and security and privacy and laws, because you have things like the FTC, which govern the export and import of specifically personal health information. So then where do you host? And so you have to judiciously and thoughtfully take something like this. You can't just put it somewhere else. You have to adapt it. And that's the process we're going through with a couple of countries now. But it's funny, the corollary to that is, in many of these countries, there's 2 to 3 cell phones per person, right? And, somebody told me recently Dubai has 3.4 to 1 is the ratio. So there you go.
It always does it different. So I think building on that idea, there's a question about how do you engage relatives of the patients? How do you,
Yeah,
I think that gets into the cultural issue.
Yeah. So it's fascinating because we can see how people are engaging with this. It's actually a fascinating statistic that most of the users who are over 65, who are male, the actual person who's administering the solution is the female caregiver, wife, sister, etc. And I think the ability to have a family member or members or friends interact with the solution is huge because they're a trusted source. In many cases, they're the ones who are the caretakers for not just their health, but for many things. And so absolutely we see a role not just for that family member, but we see a role for the social circle. Because again, you're now invoking the power of belief structures. So if there's a term we use in WellDoc, we call it mind, body, soul. If I can tap in, and today we tap into the body because it's all measures, it's numbers and, blood glucose and lipids, but if I can tap into the mind and soul vectors of a person and the things that support those vectors, you have an added opportunity to affect outcomes. And so I think it is an important forward evolution for the product.
So do they release it to their caregivers? How does that work?
It can be done. It can be done in many ways. At that point in time, if a doctor writes a prescription for me and I have a user ID login, I can consent others, my wife, if she wants to administer the solution for me. And so it's done in that very measured way for all the obvious reasons. You want to keep track of who's engaging with it and who has what user ID. And people have asked us, can I get a second login to manage my say my father who has diabetes? Would I be able to get a login so I can see how he's doing? And these are the types of things we're considering for the future.
Good. So I think that leads to the question about what are you doing to engage people around trust in the mobile health space?
Yeah,
and I think it's kind of thinking about what your privacy security policy. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, no, it's actually a very, very good question. At the end of the day, there are several layers of trust. The first layer of trust is, where is the solution coming from? And this is coming from your doctor. It's a prescription from your doctor. And generally, when you do the market research and you see the market research, people trust what their doctor tells them to do. So there's the first, I would call it the strategic level of trust. This is something that's coming from your doctor. doctor to you. It's not coming from some website. It's not coming from some ad. It's coming from your doctor. So there's already some implicit trust. At the same time, then, there has to be trust in the actual product. The product, if I'm using a product that's, kind of a generic product for, males between the ages of, I used to say 30 and 40, but I can't say that anymore, older, then it may not be right for me. But if it's my age, if it's my drug regimen, if it's my doctor's instructions, if it's got cultural needs because I'm a vegetarian and things like that, great. So I trust it more because the product attributes are related to me. Okay. Lastly, there's a technology layer of trust, the core, if you would, the fabric, encryption, privacy, security. Making sure that my personal health record on my phone is password protected, for example, right, and it's following all the NIST standards. That's an interesting. So the answer is there's multiple levels of trust that you have to build. Now, I will say this. I'm going to play devil's advocate with you. Okay, I think trust is a funny thing. I think the first two will always remain. The last one is interesting in that when you think about what people engage with on social networks today, they put a lot of stuff out there. They put a lot of stuff that you would never imagine would show up on a social network, but it's there. Personally, and I say this personally, if somebody knows I'm on metformin, it's okay, I don't care. Right? If somebody else wants to hide that, that's fine. But I think what we're seeing in society is a movement towards, everybody puts things on Facebook. Everybody puts things on Twitter. Now, is that where it's going to head with privacy laws? I don't know, crystal ball. But I think you can't ignore the fact that society is moving towards this realm where if I were to crystal ball this, I think privacy laws will evolve. I don't know how they'll evolve, but I think they'll evolve. Now, in the meanwhile, absolutely, razor sharp focus on ensuring that this is iron vaulted, locked, etc. It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves.
Great. So, so here's a question. You're focusing on type 2 diabetes with BlueStar. Do you think it's applicable to type 1?
Yeah. The perils of a small company. Type 2 happens to be, 90% of the market, and so if we're going to start fishing somewhere, that's a good place to start as a company. That being said, type 1 is a very different disease. The rules are different, the needs are different. Interoperability with things like insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors as a critical part of the solution is important. And so, yes, we are working on a type 1 solution. It is a different solution that will require its own product, that will require its own clearance from the FDA because intended use. So the intended use of BlueStar today is very clear. It's for adults with type 2 diabetes who aren't on an insulin pump, who aren't pregnant, and who aren't, I think there's one third thing which is escaping my mind now. But we will develop other solutions for not just type 1, but you think about gestational diabetes, for example, and if I could give this as an interim solution to help keep a pregnant mother healthy, and those are all the things to do.
Right. Great. Lots of science.
Lots of science. Lots of science.
So here's a question about the clinical trials. They were saying, the question is, how many patients adopted the app for daily use? How many patients started using the app and then stopped using it?
Oh, you all very good questions, whoever's asking them. I'm glad you did. So here is where I can tell you what I know today. And I can tell you what I know today where in our history, if I add up the N is around, 6,000 patients or whatever it is in history, I can do it up based on that. What we've seen is remarkable, almost uncanny, where people get on it and they stay on it. And if I look at the publication in Diabetes Care, there's a chart which shows how the A1C reduced in the first 90 to 120 days, but it stayed for their period of engagement. We had one person drop off because they were admitted to the hospital for some other, for life-threatening thing, and they weren't qualified to be in the study anymore. In our real life programs, we've seen engagement consistent, and consistency of engagement to the tune of plus or minus 10 to 12, maybe 15% throughout the year, which means they're engaging with it. They're not dropping off their engagement. Now, having said that, we have seen three behaviors of patients in terms of engagement. We've seen patients who use it, plus or minus 12%, 15%. They use it. They continue to use it. It's there for life because the disease is there for life. There's people who I would call the cyclers, Wendy, who use it, but then they stop. They stop for 3 weeks. But then they come back on it. Maybe they went on vacation or they put on some pounds or their doctor changed their regimen and they want to get better. And then we've actually seen, even though it's a very small number, but it's not zero, we've seen a group of people who were on it for, say, 6 months. That's it. But their A1Cs were 6.5. And they said, I learned how to manage my diabetes. Thank you very much. And that's fascinating because at that point in time, you've changed their behavior. But engagement, now, as N grows to, tens of thousands and millions, we'll see all kinds of clusters, and it's going to be the fun of my job, to see what can I correlate engagement with? What are the fundamental drivers of engagement? And I think fundamentally patients have told us, we value BlueStar for a couple of reasons, but primarily, one, it doesn't judge us, which is really important. They put in a high value, it says, great, you put in a value, you engage, okay, let's work on that high value. And secondly, it fits me and it allows me to do the things I want to do when I want to do it at my schedule with my doctor, and that's powerful. And we'll see how that evolves. It's going to be a fun journey.
So I'm going to ask you a question. My question: It seems like you all have spent a lot of time on the user interface. Can you talk a little bit about? Because that seems like it gets at. There's a market at the heart and soul, but kind of get the user interface is the.
Yeah. So human factors and usability are two huge, if not the largest. They stand shoulder to shoulder with clinical outcomes in science. Because it can be as wonderful as it is, but if nobody's going to use it, who cares, right? We've invested heavily as a company in terms of user experience design. And there isn't a lot written on mobile user experience. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a ton of apps out there. The question is, how can you get the engagement of some of these, fun things, but in an application that helps you manage your chronic condition? We've been fortunate. We have been working with Professor Dan Rosenberg, and Dan is a professor out in San Jose State in California. He's a former chief experience officer at SAP. And Dan has really helped us along the way to put our arms around what we can beg, borrow, steal from user experience best practices in other industries, but where we have to create the right new, in fact, he's written several textbooks on usability. He says, I might write a new textbook because we'll learn so much during this journey, but usability is paramount. You want to make this as seamless to the user. You want to make this as engaging and fun to the user. You want to invite them back. You want to give them a reason to come back. And it's simple at the end of the day. One of the guiding principles is if they engage with it, give them something of value back. And then they'll continue to engage with it. And I think that's been a powerful philosophy. I think user experience design is going to, start to think about, holographic displays and voice to text and all the crazy things you can do with technology. I think these are the rich opportunities we have ahead of us to collaborate with some of these, whiz-bang kids at Stanford and MIT who are coming up with all this crazy stuff, all of which I think can add value to how a patient engages with their disease.
Great. So there's a comment or a question in here is, how do we achieve a scalable mobile health? And I think I want to talk about that because I think part of what your World Bank came out with a statement saying the biggest problem with communication technology, mobile health, is user design. User interface. How do we work with this? And it seems to me if we want to scale, we have to pay attention. This is something we're going to have to think about in the behavioral community because what you're trying to do is a behavioral intervention with medical outcomes. But we're going to have to think about how do we make this something people want, not something we just make them do.
Yeah. It's interesting. User interface drives, if you would, in many ways, this question that I see about scalability, right? How do you get different genders, ethnicities, cultures? I think what we've learned over time, and we certainly didn't start off this way, so it's been an amazing journey for us, because I think legitimately as, one of the early movers in this industry, we made mistakes as a startup. But, that's par for the course. But one of the things we learned was if you're able to create your software architecture, develop your architecture such that the user experience layer is reasonably separable, that it's not highly connected to your logic layer or even your data layer, then you can actually change things quickly. You can actually do consumer research and patient research to find out and give them 4 ways that they may want to do something and find out what way works best. And for us, what that's meant is it's all embedded in what we call this Agile or Scrum methodology that we use to develop our software, which is interesting because now you have on one hand Scrum and Agile, and you have the requirements of the FDA, which are still show me a requirement, show me a test. And so within this broader construct, we've been able to do this rapid iterative, we call them sprints. And I think it's the architecture partially, it's the flexibility of that architecture, and then it's actually talking, and it's a global solution that needs to be localized. And I think that's how you achieve scalability, because you're able to configure this down to the individual person. And what's interesting is I can add attributes. So, you know, for example, if I'm defining or I'm describing, say, a binder, I can say, well, it's a binder, and that tells you something. And you kind of picture a binder. But then I can say it's a 3-ring binder. You see these 2 metal latches. Then I'll tell you it's a purple 3-ring binder. And so I'll add attributes that keep on giving me specificity. That's the game we want to play with patients. We want to allow them to add, you know how a LinkedIn is a professional community? Your profile. Oh, your profile is 70% complete. The more we know about patients, their hobbies, their likes, their dislikes, the more we can message and appropriately provide feedback that's conducive to them. That's how you achieve scalability.
So we're out of time, but I really want to take a moment to thank Dr. Ayer for a fascinating and wonderful talk. I also want to say that our next presentation, I would tell you the day, but I forgot it, but I'll send it out shortly. It will be the FDA talking about their mobile health guidance. So that will be Bakul Quirtel that you've mentioned, and he will be talking about their mobile health guidance. And that will be later this month. So thank you so much, and we'll look forward to you joining us again. Thank you.